This speech went from compelling story of how the former president survived an assassin's bullet to almost what felt like a campaign rally. Now, the former president recounted what happened that day in Butler, Pennsylvania. He told the crowd he's not supposed to be here, and he only is here because of the grace of God. Now, the former president had the helmet and firefighter's jacket that belonged to Corey Compertor, the man who was killed at his rally last weekend in Pennsylvania. He observed a moment of silence for him, and he told the crowd he would recount the story of that attempted assassination only one time. In a departure from his usual tone, Trump said divisions must heal and heal quickly. But then he called on Democrats to drop partisan witch hunts. He referred to election cheating, and he claimed that he's the one saving democracy.
I am running to be president for all of America, not half of America, because there is no victory in winning for half of America.
The former president also used some of that inflammatory rhetoric, including referring to illegal immigration as an invasion. He did pledge to close the border, to go ahead and cut inflation, and also reverse America's decline. Now, this was a highly produced show with such guests as Hulk Hogan and Kid Rock. In Milwaukee, Sharman Sketty, WCVB News Center 5.
Quite a week for Sharman in Milwaukee. Let's get right to it. A lot to talk about with the Sunday Roundtable. Joining me this morning, Democratic political analyst Marianne Marsh and Republican political analyst Rob Gray. Rob, let's start with you. Getting your thoughts on the RNC. The Trump-Vance ticket certainly seems to be riding high right now. The tone of the convention was changed somewhat by the assassination attempt on Donald Trump. Trump pledged unity. Some say he delivered part of the way there. Can he keep the theme going?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's not even going to be close to unity. I mean, Trump maybe kept it there for 33 minutes of the 93-minute speech. 93 minutes. But the last 60 was typical Trump. Trump knows it's about contrast. He's going to keep calling Nancy Pelosi names, Joe Biden names, Kamala Harris names, whoever the running mate, whoever the candidate is. That's what Trump does. He's not going to be able to help himself. And he couldn't help himself even all the way through the speech, Marianne.
No, and no surprise. I mean, the only unity that exists is the Republicans who are at that convention all agree on the Project 2025, which was front and center throughout this entire convention. And Donald Trump delivered the back half of the speech, the other hour plus, and the dystopian view that looked like the speech he gave at his inauguration in 2017. So
American carnage.
American carnage. And that's exactly what I have to acknowledge the Elvis setup here from 1978. But when you look at all this, Trump is saying, I want to represent everyone, I want unity, but only if you agree with me on ditching Ukraine, standing up with Putin, a national abortion ban, the 2020 election was rigged. That's his litmus test.
Let's talk about J.D. Vance. He's the junior senator from Ohio. He's best known, though, for writing that best-selling book, Hillbilly Elegy. And I want to bring up 2 points, Marianne, and get your reaction. I think it was about 90 minutes after that assassination attempt last weekend. He immediately blamed Democrats and Joe Biden for their rhetoric in spawning the assassination attempt. He has said he might not certify, he wouldn't have certified the election like Mike Pence did. So is this unity?
No. In fact, either one or both of those are disqualifying. He should not be a vice president just for either one of those stands, let alone both. So what he's telling everyone is, I'll do whatever Donald Trump wants me to do. That's number one. Number two, when you look at J.D. Vance, he's exactly half the age of Donald Trump. So he is the next generation of MAGA that will be led by Don Jr. and J.D. Vance. And that's what you're seeing here. When Donald Trump is gone and, at the end of his career, they're going to take over MAGA.
And Rob, there seems to be this thought process among political pundits out there. I worked in Pennsylvania for 10 years. I don't know that I see it, that somehow a senator from Ohio, because it neighbors Michigan and Pennsylvania, is going to help. Do you believe that?
I do think that in addition to what Marianne said, that he's the next generation of MAGA and close to Trump's son, I think that's half of why he was picked. But you've touched on the other reason. I do believe that Trump believes that because it's a cultural thing. It's not just your home state. Those are, Midwestern states, or at least part of Pennsylvania is. They border on Ohio. They fit in to J.D. Vance's book. Also Wisconsin, add that to the mix as well. if Trump wins one of those three, he's going to be the next president.
Talk about an avalanche of news in the last week. Joe Biden diagnosed with COVID. He is isolating in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware at his home there, but there may be no cure for his ailing presidential campaign. He's been defiant up until now, but is that defiance about to become acceptance, and will he step aside?
You know, there's been a 3-week pressure campaign on Joe Biden to step aside. And in many respects, Democrats have done more harm to themselves than Donald Trump has. But I think we're reaching the end of this at some point, probably early, tomorrow, at some point right in the next 24, 48 hours. A decision will be made, and it's likely that Joe Biden will decide to continue as president but not run for re-election. We will see what happens. But it's been a really rocky road, and whatever the decision is, it needs to be made now because there are only 107 days left. And Democrats just have to put their heads down, work, and make sure they win the election, who's ever at the top of the ticket.
Rob?
The best models show that since the train wreck of a debate in June for Biden, Trump's percentage chance to win has risen from 60-40 to 70-30. We're seeing that carry over to battleground states as well. So Biden's in big trouble.
Republicans have said, Marianne, that the number of swing states is growing. It's not just the 6 or 7 that were, kind of in the middle in 2016 and in 2020. Is Kamala Harris the right choice? Should Joe Biden step aside?
Well, for political and practical reasons, she would be the right choice. Political reasons, women and black voters overwhelmingly support her. If you're a Democrat running anywhere, let alone nationally, you have to have both those groups. And practically, because she would inherit the Biden-Harris money,
yeah,
the
like
resources,
90 million or so
the organization, all of that. And she would automatically get that transferred over to her. Anybody else would have to start from scratch.
But while swing states might be growing now, I think Republicans, and we saw this at the convention, they have to be careful not to be too overconfident here. Trump looks very good right now. We've seen how fast this race changed in just 1 month. It can change again back in the other direction. So I think swing states might be expanding. More likely, Trump's ability to win in the pre-existing swing states, like the Arizonas and the Nevada, his margin has expanded there. I'm not sure Republicans are going to put new states on the table, and they better be careful if they try and compete in bubble states.
If you look at the polling, it's 1 to 5 points everywhere. In any state that has just come on, that's easy to recapture and all of that. So I think you have to look at that wide spectrum of 1 to 5 points anyone can overcome with organization.
And I have to get you both quickly on this. A running mate, if it is Kamala Harris, who's the running mate?
You always pick the opposite, so it would probably be a white male governor, Shapiro, but I don't think he'll do it. In Pennsylvania, Beshear in Kentucky, Cooper in North Carolina, you got to believe they're at the top of the list.
Rob?
So I don't agree. I actually say go with the Clinton-Gore model, double down. They went with youth, new generational leadership, even though it was 2 white males from the South. Kamala Harris, I'd go with another woman, and I'd play that card.
Oh, interesting. All right, more and with the roundtable after the break.